All right. In the interest of time, since I'm noticing it is now one after, I will go ahead and get started. I've got a preamble anyway that we're going to work through, so that will give more folks time to join. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending this policy pop-up webinar organized by the Professional Development and Enrichment Subcommittee of the Professional and Administrative Senate. My name is Alex Badges. I'm a senator on the PNA Senate representing CFANS. I'm also the co-chair of the PD&E subcommittee. We are grateful to see so many of you in attendance here for today's event. On behalf of all of us here at PNA Senate, we appreciate and value your engagement in our programming. Our session today is titled Exploring the Indigenous Research Policy and Guidelines, What You Need to Know to Build Relationships with Tribal Nations. Whether you are new to working with tribal governments or have already had research or service in tribal communities this morning, you'll learn about the University of Minnesota's new Indigenous research policy and how it should inform, impact, and contribute to your work. This will include practical tips for getting started and how to be a good partner and ally. Today, to speak on this policy, we are very lucky to have Karen Diver, who is the inaugural Senior Advisor to the President for Native American Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Her previous roles in higher education include serving as a faculty fellow for inclusive excellence at the College of St. Scholastica and as faculty within the Masters in Tribal Administration and Governance program at the University of Minnesota Duluth. Karen was also special assistant to the president for Native American Affairs in the Obama White House as part of the Domestic Policy Council from November 2015 until the end of the administration. She also served as chairwoman of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa from 2007 to 2015, managing the second largest workforce in northern Minnesota and a high-capacity tribal government. Her current service includes serving as a U.S. Commissioner on the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. She is also a member of the climate-related Financial Risk Advisory Committee of the Financial Stability Oversight Council at the Department of Treasury. Lastly, she is a member of the Board of Governors for the Honoring Nations program with the Harvard Kennedy School Project for Indigenous Governance and Development. She has a bachelor's in economics from the University of Minnesota Duluth and a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. So she has a long list of accolades and she's highly knowledgeable about today's subject. So we're so grateful to have her here. A quick word about how today's webinar will work. Karen has prepared about 35 minutes worth of material to help us dive into and understand the use policy and to provide context for it. After presenting that material, we will open up the rest of the session for Q&A. I encourage you all to use the Q&A feature of Zoom to post questions for Karen, which you can do at any time during today's webinar. Please do not use the chat for this. If you have any technical questions, we have two other members of the committee here today, Barb and Jake from the PD&E committee, who are here to help you. So please message them directly in the chat if you are having any problems. I should also note that today's webinar will be recorded. It is being recorded right now, and it will be made available to all registrants via email when it is ready, as well as made available on the PNA Senate website. However, it may take a week or three for that recording to be available because we have to caption it, and that can take some time. So in the meantime, I just urge you all to please remain patient. With all of that out of the way, I'm going to hand things off to Karen. So Karen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you for the kind invitation to be here today. And for all of you joining, I know it's the end of semester. Everybody gets a little frazzled at this time of year. I very much appreciate the gift of your time and interest in the subject matter. I was sharing with the committee this morning as I was preparing for you this morning, I was screenshotting things, and then it occurred to me, why don't I just show you where it is rather than showing you pictures of it. So we do have a new Indigenous research policy. It has been fully approved. I think it was in June, early June. I will say that there's this part of me who says, as a non-academic, I was actually kind of proud of myself for figuring out the rather onerous policy development protocol. But I've talked to so many of you over the last 2 years about this and why it's important. It's important because tribes have said we want relationships with the University of Minnesota. We want them to be in a very good way. We want them to respect our tribal sovereignty and our self-determination. Um, as I spoke to all of you in consultation regarding the policy, um, it's community engaged research, right? Where we are actually responsible to and working with the community. And it's very much like also foreign research, right? What do you do if you are researching in a foreign country? Well, you have a host, you learn the customs and the norms, you follow all the laws of that country and regulations. Tribal governments are no different. They're another jurisdiction um, where they have governmental authority over what happens in their community. I am going to share my screen and we are going to talk about this. Okay, so this is the web page for my office. It's naa.umn.edu. And in addition to the Indigenous research guidelines, we also have other things that are available for you that we will update. Best case scenario, you might find something in there. We're going to be updating this prior to the end of the year to have other resources that you might be able to use in your syllabus. Because Indigenous issues, Native American issues actually have a place in all of our curriculum. And we want Native learners to be able to see themselves within the academy and know that what we're teaching is relevant to them, their people, their communities, and it's not always just from a Western-based focus. So we will have some of those things on this tab. The third tab, though, is all about the Indigenous research guidelines. We do have a LibGuide available to you that just shows research, different research. Well, I guess I can show you, right? Different research and relationship building links for you, a list of tribes, tribal leader directories. There's even a section on land acknowledgements. Um, what was first developed actually wasn't the policy, it was the Indigenous Research Guidelines. And that was done with a couple of people that I think are attending today, but also about 24 others. They were Indigenous researchers, faculty, some of the research center directors. They were not all Indigenous. Some had experience working with tribal communities already, some had none and we're eager to learn and kind of contribute to what would be best practices. So as you look, actually, I'm going to start with the policy itself because the policy is actually much shorter than the guidelines. The guidelines are there to provide you more expansive explanations than what occurs in the policy. So when you look at the policy, we have the first thing, consider Indigenous rights, tribal self-determination and tribal research. People said, well, that word consider, why don't you say you must? And the thing is tribes are not monolithic, right? They're not going to have the same opinion all of the time on what might be going on. It depends on the community you're entering, if it's broad and multi-tribal work. So the best that you can do is actually have that relationship and that communication, right? And just explain the why. Consider Indigenous rights means that where they can be accommodated, you should, or find a plan B, right? Or come up with a different protocol. So it's not a situation where you can say, 100% of the time, um, you will always consider tribal wants and needs. I'll give you an example. We had a situation where there was some research being done off of tribal lands, but the tribes felt they had an interest and they would have prefer it not occurred. I was able to talk to the tribe and say, well, what exactly are your concerns? And they were like, you shouldn't do this. I'm like, yeah, but why do you say that? Why do you feel this? And once they talked to me, I was able to talk to the researcher and kind of mitigate what the tribes viewed as risky. And it actually was not something that the researcher was opposed to. It was something they could easily accommodate. And so that was a consideration. We took the no down to mitigating the risks that the tribes had identified. So that is about considering. But you absolutely do have to follow all appropriate protocols and laws. If you are on tribal lands, those are within a reservation borders. The tribe is that authority. Tribes will require you to let them know you're there, get permission, whether it includes tribal people, an IRB situation, whether it's natural resources. So anytime you set foot on a reservation, you should have permission of that tribe. And have a complete understanding of what is their protocol regarding access to their tribal lands and or their people. There is a training available to you on the training hub. If you go through Rio and you fill out a sponsored project form or a IRB submission, it will get routed to my office. And that's one of the things I'm going to ask in advance is, did you take the tribal university relations class in the training hub? Over 900 people have taken that class so far to date, or that training. Um, I I've heard good things about it. I've heard it's like not overly onerous. It's really informative. It's not real heavy. Of course, I don't know if people would be so inclined to come tell me that they thought it sucked, but so far that has not happened. Um, and I'm hoping that that's the case for everyone. Um, and if there is something I can do to improve it, I certainly would be open to you letting us know. Um, this one references the guidelines. Um, Tribes are very much relational. And so the time to start talking to them about what you're thinking is actually before you're ready. Right now, National Science Foundation is requiring proof of tribal consent for research involving indigenous peoples and their lands. I hear that coming down the pike is also National Institutes of Health is also working on it. So when you fill out your paperwork, your submission forms through Rio, that is one of the things I will ask. Can you please upload your proof of tribal consent? What's the sweet spot we're hoping for regarding tribal research? That it's not solely driven by the interests of the researcher, that because you're building those relationships, that you are really informed by those relationships. And we're actually bringing value back to the tribes around what are gaps in their knowledge, what do tribal governments need to expand their decision making and ascertain what where gaps are, whether it's in their natural resources, whether it's public health, whether it's youth and resiliency, education. There's huge data and knowledge gaps from research that tribal leaders actually really struggle with. But the research we end up getting back is very much driven usually by the interests of the researcher. Where we can find researchers that have built those respectful relationships and we can say, please help us understand this. Um, that creates a much more amenable working relationship. And I have every researcher that's undertaken that relationship building and that reciprocal benefit model has actually said that it has benefited them individually in their own scholarship in terms of understanding issues in particular to tribal nations. Example, the Cloquet Forestry Center. Once our forest research staff actually started interacting with reservation, natural resource managers, and forestry staff, they started to be able to learn more about caring for the landscape and the role of cultural burning and fire, and how that really helps with fuel reduction, with understory management and blueberry habitat, removal of invasives, all kinds of things. And of course, that's something that the tribes had done as millennia. But yet all of our forest management policy has generally been about, leave things pristine, and that we don't have to actively manage forest landscape. And so those conversations between our researchers and tribal um, practitioners, and then with the addition of traditional ecological knowledge, has just meant that there's just been this wealth of information sharing, and especially as the tribe prepares for climate change, and our research is really focused on um, resiliency and adaptation. These conversations are becoming something that will benefit really all of us in caring for our natural landscape. So relationships before, build trust, build communications, see what you can do. Who do you contact? And we talk about that more in the guidelines. So I'm going to get to that one in a minute, the practical parts of tribal interactions. Establish data sovereignty parameters utilizing policies and protocols on that resources tab from the LibGuide. There are links to different resources, especially out of the University of Arizona Native Nations Institute around tribal data sovereignty and how we use it. So one of the things that I know concerns some of the researchers at University of Minnesota is, we have a policy that all research is public, and you can ask for waivers from the Office of General Counsel to accommodate tribal sovereignty and tribal wishes. In many cases, tribes aren't opposed at all to publication. It's around that communication and parameters. When I was tribal chair, there was occasions where I would say, this is good information. Other people need to know this, policymakers. Can we do it in aggregate form and only have disaggregated data based on my tribe come back to us only? And we were able to accommodate that through this public researcher, through the state actually. So you will have those conversations about what's the next thing. Um, then find out if they have an IRB. Like I said earlier, in many cases, tribes have an IRB that covers any research happening in tribal communities or their tribal community or with their people. Um, so the IRB covers everything, even natural resources. Um, and some tribes are not in that place. And so one of the things that is in the guidelines is the ethical responsibility for how we conduct ourselves within what we call Indian country, which is a legal term, is that we behave like they have an IRB from the University of Minnesota, whether the tribe has that capacity or not. Go through the same mechanisms, the same communications that would be required of you. Help them learn how to manage us, and just really show good relationality and, like I said, build that trust. And then what are you going to do with this later? What's the plan later? So you're actually committing to some long-term discussions and feedback and updates with the folks you build those relationships with. Um, and then tribal consent is not optional. If you're told no, the answer is no. Um, you don't want to hear no, though. And so that's why we have the guidelines, is how do you get to the point where um, you can actually get them to a yes and have them value what you're trying to contribute. And, a lot of that comes through them understanding what you're trying to accomplish and then what you're going to do with that information. And then the training requirement link is off of this page right there. Um, why do we have this policy? Uh, Tribes had expressed through the years that sometimes it felt exploitive and extractive, and that in some cases researchers came in without any really basic knowledge of Indigenous peoples, tribal communities. And so they thought that their product was flawed because they were looking at it through this lens that lacked really understanding of the perspectives, the culture, the spirituality, the connections of Indigenous peoples. And so what came out of it then, um, really didn't reflect how the tribe would have saw that same information, because they weren't given a chance to see it or participate. And then there is frequently asked questions on there. You are always, always, always able to um, contact me. My email is just karend@umn.edu. And then when you go to the guidelines, like I said, these are much more robust than the policy, and it's a companion to the policy. And there's a lot more kind of it's simple language. It was geared towards anybody who's involved in tribal relationship building and might be involved in research. So this is community-based advisory boards, undergraduate researchers, through to senior researchers and faculty. So the language is fairly plain and clear. Um, and there's a always in guidelines. There's a bunch of definitions. Like preferred language is in there. We do outline the 11 federally recognized tribes in Minnesota and give you links for contacting them. So one of the things that I've seen personally is, someone said, well, I don't want to have to go through all of that with the tribe, so I'm just going to work with urban native populations. Well, that would not be a best practice. And it actually is kind of counterintuitive to consent. It's to say, it's too much work to build a relationship and have people agree to what I'm doing. So I'm just going to bypass all of that. It almost is saying that I want to behave in a way that is not good, right? So we don't recommend that you do that and think that you are not accountable. In fact, the onus is then on you to build that accountability. Um, whether it's working with an Indigenous nonprofit, creating an advisory board of respected folks that are closely aligned with your discipline. We can help and give you some ideas of where you might go. But the accountability back, you need to kind of replicate those systems. It's an ethics check. The other thing I will kind of say about the ethics check and why a policy was really necessary in these guidelines is one harmful act actually reflects on all of us at the University of Minnesota. The distinction of I work in this college in this field, I'm not the one who did this over in public health isn't going to wash. What tribes here is the University of Minnesota behaved badly. So a part of this is also accountability and reputational value of all of us collectively at the University of Minnesota. Very first and foremost, do no harm to Indigenous peoples and tribes, but also do no harm to the reputational values that tribes are trying to build. Excuse me, the University of Minnesota is trying to build with tribes. So off reservation, urban populations, and it's a real thing, right? About half of Native people live off reservation. So there is some critical mass for some of this, but we'll want to put those safeguards into place. And then once again, build that relationship. I know this is repetitive, but it bears saying again, build the relationship first. So here's what we're doing to help you with this. We are not there yet, but we are putting the building blocks in place. What I consider kind of the infrastructure within our institutions that build up our capacity to really thrive in this arena. Um, I have asked the deans of the colleges to each identify somebody who would serve as a tribal liaison. In some cases, that's their DEI person. In the case of CFANS, they've actually hired a full-time tribal liaison. The equities are enough within CFANS that that makes real sense. It might make sense where there's a critical mass of research happening the health careers, maybe all of the health folks might want to share that tribal liaison as one discipline, right? But regardless, we've designated some folks within the colleges now as a tribal liaison, and we're building a community of practice. We are writing tribal consultation guidelines. Their job is going to be to help build those relationships and manage the University of Minnesota. As a former tribal leader, um, it strikes fear in my heart, the thought of like 400 researchers all thinking that they could call up a tribal chair and have FaceTime and want to be our new best friend, right? And that is just not the protocol. They run nations. So if I am a health researcher, I should be talking to the health director. So if we could manage it where we build relationships with tribal health directors within those colleges that are relevant at the University of Minnesota, then maybe we can manage it where the research deans are then we're managing the relationship in a little bit more at a balcony level where make a health director advisory board, touch bases a couple times a year in person, let them know what we're working on. But then we have those relationships to personally um, talk about when specific research projects might be coming up or grant opportunities or things like that. So we're building that capacity now. It will take us a little bit. In the meantime, though, I'm hoping to be on the agenda for the Council of Associate Research Deans in January to talk about how they can organize at the college level. And in the meantime, the community of practice will continue to meet and kind of grow in their um, capacity and ability. They're in the process of taking their trainings now, and then, like I said, developing the consultation policy. So building relationship, until we have that capacity, find your peer. Find your peer in the tribe. Like I said, if you're it's a health research, you go to the health director. If it's education, there's superintendents of schools or there's a health director or commission. Um, commissioner in some cases they're called. Um, if it's natural resources, go to the natural resources director. Tribes have those hierarchies in place, um, and they all have websites. You can call their switchboards and say, who would I talk to about this? And they will give you to the right person. Um, we talked about this in the policy, figure out what the tribal approval is. If you're not sure, you can ask for tribal legal counsel or government affairs person and ask them about their IRB process or research approval process, and they can get you to the right folks. Um, be ready when you go in. Understand that community. Um, I'm always a little surprised as people who are in the business of knowledge creation, that people will talk to me and they hadn't even looked at a tribal website yet. And then they want me to broker an approval for a grant that's due next week. And unfortunately, I just have to say, I can't do that, right? You're not ready. You're asking something and you didn't even give them the courtesy of understanding the people that you're saying you want to work with. Um, and I can't explain to them what the purpose is and how it benefits their community, right? So you're coming like way too late into the process. It's starting to feel like that old way of doing business where we didn't think we had to have permission. Um, so engage in that self-education and engage in self-reflection. What are you trying to accomplish and why would a tribe want to work with you? Um, assess tribal capacity, interest, and demand. Sometimes tribes might not just have the capacity to honor your wishes. It's just a fact. Much like any other governmental bureaucracy, we have lean times, we have priorities that we're trying to do within the breadth of governmental structures. Um, and we just might not have staff capacity. The Natural Resources and Environmental Division, I mean, they're dealing with everything from regulation of air and water to extractive industry permitting, water quality testing, and not to mention managing our treaty rights, right? And our habitat and restoration activities. Um, it might not be that they want to say no, it might be not right now, but once again, if you're in that relationship, you learn the ebbs and flows, and they'll want to make time for you if they can. But you want to create that space for them to say, this is something that I have to prioritize my current workload. Um, Also, you know, time matters, and there's opportunity cost for our folks too. And they are experts in different ways, and much like you might get called upon to give a keynote or provide an expert opinion, you expect to be some compensated for that. um, Engaging with tribal communities ends up being different just because complicated family structures, elder care, child care. Do they have to take time off of work? How do you recognize participation? This is also a way for us to talk about, we talk further about this, about how do we engage junior Indigenous scholars as well and help them build their academic chops by finding mentors to work in the community, and how can you make that a mutually beneficial relationship? Um, so look for Indigenous peers within the academy. And then if you're going to have any kind of advisory committee or anything like that, or if you plan on doing interviews, build it into your grant to give honoraria. It's very culturally appropriate to do that within our nations. Figure out just how to, I do talk about finding the proper person, who you are. It's generally good protocol to bring a small gift. I know we've all got, like drawers full of U of M swag. It doesn't have to be something really big. A travel mug with, some candy in it or something like that. Chances are pretty good that you will be honored with the gift when you come to our community. It's very culturally appropriate to be given a gift of wild rice or, a bottle of honey or something like that. And so you'll want to come. You are recognizing that they are giving you the gift of their time and attention, and that they are welcoming you as a guest. And so you want to acknowledge that. Be patient. You know, uh, those of you who remember Joan Gable, I had to tell her, like, don't look at your watch, be present in the moment. Things start late. If you can't be here and be gracious and wait for your time and just be in place, then just leave now, because otherwise you're going to annoy people. You're just not in charge, right? You need to give up some of those control issues, and operate in this other environment, and then accept no. Um, I'm going to let you continue to look at this on your own, like recognize when your research might have impact. How do you talk about that? How do you look at data sovereignty? And so this document has a lot more of that practical guidance and kind of balcony level understanding, and the ethics. It's all footnoted. You can click on it. You can talk about disseminating research, etc. And all of that is available to you on the website. Here's the thing I'm going to tell you. I feel like I've kind of talked a lot at you, um, but I'm just going to say, um, what does it mean to be in good relations? What does it mean to operate with good ethics? I mean, it's really about the values that we say we have at the University of Minnesota and keeping them right here. when you're thinking about doing this work and how does this feel? If I were this community, if I was this person, how would this make me feel? And if you are self-reflective in that manner, as a general rule, you're going to be just fine. We will continually add to these resources as time goes on. Um, and so do bookmark my website, and check it often. I am about at the end of my time, so I am going to stop my share and take your questions.
Hello, everybody. I'm turning my camera back on and making Zoom behave itself because it is now, for some reason, split across two of my monitors, which is very annoying. So give me a half a second here. Okay, we're gonna now enter the Q&A portion. I'm going to read off the questions here as we go so that they're in the transcript for those of us who will be watching the recording. And I'm going to try to capture the spirit of your question, if not exactly read them word for word. So if at any point I don't fully capture the question, please let me know and you can ask again in the Q&A if there was a part of this that I missed. But we'll start with this question. What are the protocols, best practices for trying to conduct research on urban, or with, I should say, urban indigenous populations? What are sort of the outline steps for that?
So it depends on what your discipline is, and whether or not there is some alignment with some of the existing nonprofit organizations. For example, in the health field, you have Native American Community Clinic, and some other Indian health focused organizations that do have IRB protocols and are willing to kind of serve that function and will provide you letters of support because they have an agreement with you to provide that function. Um, Mostly we're talking about the people. When you talk about urban Indian populations, because there aren't reservation homelands, so you're not talking about physical sciences and things like that. So, um, you know, probably the only like physical, like geography based ones is St. Anthony Falls is a huge sacred space. So there's a group that actually is caretaking, Owamiyami, the falls, and they would want to be consulted around any kind of physical science around St. Anthony Falls.
Great. Okay, the next question I'm actually going to bundle two. How do we find out who our tribal liaison is if we have one? If we're not sure, who should we talk to? And what are the roles and responsibilities of our tribal liaisons if we have one in our role?
Um, I would ask your dean. The deans are the ones that had to designate them. If you don't have one, encourage your dean to let me know and we'll add them to the community of practice. Um, the roles and responsibilities are evolving. Right now, we're just working on getting them trained before we let them loose too far. We want them to understand and take the tribal university's training to review all of the guidelines. But the CFANs, because they have a full-time person, she's hitting the ground running. She's calling up every tribe and making meetings with their natural resources and environmental directors. And she's going to be connecting with her research dean. So the hope is that they will manage themselves to be prepared to have those conversations about what are the interests in the natural resources ag space. Um, and so that would be your go-to then, for research, is to say, hey, tribal liaison, I'm interested in this. Will the tribes be okay with it, or do you think partnering? And they can help you broker that relationship, have meetings with you, because they've built those initial relationships. We are not there yet. I need to be clear. It is a work in progress, but it is a huge focus of mine for the next year.
Great. Someone's asking about the Tribal University Relations training course in the training hub. I'm actually hoping that Barb, Ellie, or Jake might go find it and dump a link into the chat to that. someone is considering having their team complete it, how long would you guess that that process might take?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm assuming a few hours, but it's in modules. So you don't have to complete it all in one sitting.
Okay, great.
I have not taken the whole thing from beginning to end, partly because
Okay.
I live it, right? But
Right. But still, it's a good frame of reference. I'm going to paraphrase this next question. I think it's kind of a hypothetical, or not a hypothetical, but I'm going to sort of generalize it. Uh, there's a research team who recognizes the need and the responsibility to connect with tribal partners. And generally speaking, they've articulated here that they plan to do everything right. I'll put out there, but they are having trouble getting in contact with the person who they feel like is probably the right partner for the research they want to do, and just is wondering if you have any advice in that situation. And thinking more broadly, I know you touched on this, but a lot of times the appropriate potential partner here is somebody who has a lot of other commitments and may be wearing many hats, and how do you negotiate that?
best case scenario is you're starting to build the relationship before you have the idea. I mean, in this case, it seemed like they were proposing a project and kind of, might be ready to go. And the timing just might be bad. So try again. Um, Ask to set up a time, to have a meeting, or if they would refer you to somebody, that would be best to have the initial conversation with, and then form that relationship over time. I know that, like there's certain times of the year you're not going to reach anybody within some of these divisions, right? Um, or spring netting, wild rice season, sugar bush, moose hunt, deer hunt, um, you know, um, all of that. So, different people have availability at other times. Summer is ceremony season. Summer is also the only nice time we have in Minnesota, and people do lots of stuff. But that's also when faculty have time available, right? Um, so just have those conversations. Don't let one time stop you. But on the other hand, if you have that meeting and they say, quit bothering me, then they're just plain not interested.
Yeah, I thank you very much for that answer. Someone went and grabbed the link to the training course, and others have been noting in here that they took the training. It definitely wasn't something they felt like they needed to do all in one sitting, and that it took them roughly a couple of hours or less to complete. So for those of you who are wondering about that, we have some people in the audience who have firsthand experience and knowledge there. This next question has to do with how should we go about framing the importance of honoring Native wisdom and incorporating that into the research that's being done, and probably, I would imagine, the outputs that are coming out of that research as well.
Thank you for that question. And it's interesting to me. When Dean Boer and I tease him relentlessly because when we talk about building tribal relationships and when he was thinking about hiring the liaison, and I said to him, I'm like, Brian, why do you think tribes would trust you? You trademarked an apple. Like we're really proud of that, right? The trademark of the apple. It's like one of the things that is within the university ethos is we count those and we promote those. And but yet from an indigenous perspective, it's just like they trademarked food. It's just the value difference that you're bringing to it is so incredibly different, right? In this day and age where we're kind of challenged by climate change and all of these other issues, all of a sudden there's this gravitas being given to tribal ecological knowledge, right? And a part of what this policy is trying to do in talking about like data sovereignty agreements and having upfront MOUs and things like that is asking tribes what they consent to letting other people know. And why would that be kind of important at this point? It's protecting what we know from being commercialized, exploited. And unless you think I'm overreacting, we had an instance in Australia with some colleagues of mine over there that I've worked with where they brought researchers in the country and we're talking about bush medicines. And the next thing you know, it was being patented and sold commercially. Um, sacred places and gathering points, and cultural sites, from an institution that used to dig up ancestors, right? Um, and that still happens today. Fond du Lac bought a sacred site back, and it was, the news got a hold of it. I was at the site 48 hours later, and there were already shovel marks around it of people looking for artifacts. So having those discussions and actually formal agreements of how we intend to hold ourselves accountable and what is for public and for dissemination um, is absolutely within the tribe's purview to control. And but they're not knowledge hoarders. I mean, we actually kind of value that what we've learned through observation and caretaking of our relatives and being observers, of our communities and all of those oral histories. We understand that that is knowledge creation of a different format than Western-based education systems. And we know we need to marry the two in many cases, for meeting the challenges of the future. Um, it's just having that conversation up front and having that agreement.
Great. I think this next question is more of really a comment, so I'll just put it on sort of the record, but it seems like someone is interested in having a go-to list of potential liaisons because they're thinking about staff members and graduate students who may feel like they don't have a direct line to their dean, but still may want
Um,
to connect with a liaison or a tribal partner and just would love to know exactly where to look for that information. So I'm passing that along here. Um,
if I could comment really quickly, thank you.
yeah,
I often forget that hierarchy is a real thing because I make myself accessible to whoever. I don't care. I'll talk to anybody, right? Students I have Zooms with, whatever, right? But people perceive a hierarchy that it's inhibitive, I think, to sometimes getting our work done. So here's what I'll do. My associate is actually taking some leave to the end of the year, but we'll make sure the list of tribal liaisons gets put on the webpage. I just want to give the liaisons a heads up that we're going to do that first.
great, thank you. Similarly, actually, somebody pointed out that the document that was on screen, I think that's the guidelines. They
Yeah.
were noting that they don't have access to it in a way that allows them to print it or download it. They can only get a shortcut of it, so there may be some access restriction on that document currently that is making it so that not everybody can access that document in maybe the ways that they're looking for.
Good. Well, I didn't have a hard time going from the website to that, but that doesn't mean anything because I'm the document owner. Um, Let me do a little checking and I will fix it.
Great. Um, the next question is about a land acknowledgement. Does the university have an official land acknowledgement? And if not, where should we be looking for resources on crafting a land acknowledgement that feels specific to our place within the university?
We don't have an official land acknowledgement, and frankly, I get my chops busted about that every now and then. People think that should be a primary part of my job. And then I remind people that it's not for me to tell you how you acknowledge the land. Um, The point is the person who's saying it needs to feel it and believe it, right? And many of the colleges on the Twin Cities campus have one. There's some guidance from the Native Governance Center on creating a land acknowledgement. I really like UMD's land acknowledgement. I actually tried at one point, and much like all of the other group projects in higher ed, once you get so many people weighing in and having an opinion, it just creates this inertia and general lack of agreement to the point where you're not going to get everybody to agree. So I just moved on. Here's the one thing I will tell everybody that I require and who've asked me about a land acknowledgement. Be historically accurate, but land acknowledgements in many ways are very much past looking. And it says, who were the people of the land. We're all still here. Your land acknowledgements should say, what happened historically, who lived here historically, and then acknowledge that in a very contemporary way. My whole job is trying to serve the tribes and the native learners and communities that are here right now. Say what you're going to commit to do. Say, I live on the land of the historical and contemporary lands of the Dakota, and here's what I commit to do to make the university or my college or my department or my lab a better place for Indigenous peoples today.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you. The next question here in the Q&A, someone's wondering how the University of Minnesota's designers connected to Dakota and Ojibwe creative peoples to co-create interpretive sites along the North Shore.
Say that again, please.
Yeah, the question is, how did or do University of Minnesota designers connect with Dakota and Ojibwe creative peoples to co-create the interpretive sites that are along the North Shore? I I don't actually know what they're talking about, but I was hoping you might.
Yeah, I do not.
Okay,
Um, so
if that person who asked that question can provide a little bit more context, that would be great.
I would say, if Minnesota Department of, so the state of Minnesota actually, every single state department has a tribal liaison, a full-time paid position. In addition, there's a state law that requires state employees to be trained. It's a big project out of the University of Minnesota Duluth American Indian Studies Department to do the tribal state relations training. And so I know that, like signage, in the language and all of that is done through MnDOT and their tribal liaisons, work with tribes, language speakers, and then they run that language through the tribes before it gets printed on the big signs.
That's great. Oh yeah, the state's tribal relations training is excellent. Somebody just noted here in the Q&A. Another question here. I actually personally have a question, so I'm going to jump in and throw a question in here too for you, Karen. Um, can you speak a little bit to the folks in the room who maybe haven't considered doing research that involves tribal partners before and are wondering, what opportunities exist here that maybe I haven't considered before? Um, what would you say to folks who have not considered doing research that may intersect with tribes in the past?
So I'm not going to say you should. If it's not in your interest, I mean, then don't. I mean, that's okay too, right? I would say start slow. If you're a person who uses, like, for example, demographic information and you have Black, white, Asian, other, you are not ready to work with tribal communities because you are not even paying attention to them in your existing data sets, right? Take that next step and do another column before you other, right? Um, on the other hand, maybe that is an interest and you see that there might be an intersection with your discipline or particular field of study. Um, and that would bring value to you and back to the community. Talk to your liaison, start socializing the idea um, far prior than a grant submission deadline or a study. One of the things that I'm trying to do, and it's on my website, is, um, and I remind tribes, if you have a research need, you tell me, I will find you a researcher. So that tribes are actually requesting what they need. By the way, I need somebody who knows freshwater mollusks, if anybody's in the room. Um, um, a little esoteric, I know this, but that's one of the requests I've had is they're interested in doing a restoration activity in the Mississippi and they want to know what needs to happen in terms of water flow, clarity, quality, to do restoration activities. So if we know of anybody like that. So I'm also trying, the point of that long story is, um, let me know if you ever have an interest. I might be able to guide you. Um, and then the flip side is I'm also asking tribes to let us know so they can drive some of that agenda.
Yeah, I should mention, think one of a whole bunch of people are chiming in on that one. From my neck of the woods, I'm in FWCB within CFANS, and there's a number of people who come to mind for me about freshwater mollusks, and they're sharing that information. Mark Hovey is a name that's coming up in here, but Naomi, one of my colleagues, is also raising her hand about that. So it's good that
Okay,
we've had that conversation.
okay, email me, email me. I have people
Yeah.
for you to talk to.
Um, I have one final question and then we'll wrap up here. I know you mentioned earlier that the tribes are not a monolith, and I think that's a really good and important point to emphasize. If someone's interested in doing statewide research or the context is statewide, such that it makes sense to them, at least abstractly, to interface with all 11 tribal governments, is there some advice you have about how to navigate that situation?
Um, so 10 of the 11 tribes meet regularly through the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. The Minnesota Indian Affairs Council is a state board. Tribes do not cede their sovereignty to a state board, so they can't take a vote and impose their will on the other tribes, but it's a good communication tool. And although technically we are not a state agency, it is a good way to talk to 10 of the 11. Upper Sioux is the one that does not participate and will require individual communication. Um, and I know that there's some folks within the university that have used that as a tool. They have subcommittees that you can go to as well. And Shannon Gishik is the executive director and can help you navigate and get on the agenda. Minnesota Indian Affairs Council has a website. Um, and the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, which is 6 of the 7 Ojibwe tribes, also meets and has a subcommittee structure. So if you're looking at northern Minnesota in particular, that is another good way to talk to them, or at least make initial acquaintances. And then, of course, entirely appropriate to it, follow up individually if they so request.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. With that, we're going to conclude today's webinar because I'm noticing it's basically the hour. On behalf of PNA Senate, Karen, we want to thank you so much for speaking to us today on such a vital topic that's relevant to the work we're doing here at the U. I think you did really well to highlight the opportunities inherent in this policy, and I'm sure our discussion today was both interesting and informative for everyone in attendance, so thank you again. Before we end, I want to encourage everyone to consider serving on PNA Senate if you have not previously done so. If you value programming like today's webinar, and this is the first of many that will be coming from our committee in this term, it takes the participation and encouragement of people like you to make them happen. Plus, of course, every voice counts in matters at the university level. So if you are interested in learning more about Senate governance, please go online to the university website, the University Senate website at www.usenate.umn.edu. We'd also very much value your feedback, and we value your participation in events like this. There will be a post-event evaluation, which you will receive via email, and I will also drop a link to that in the chat here in just a couple of seconds. Please fill it out if you have a chance to do so. Again, thank you very much, Karen, for your presentation today. And thank you to everyone else who attended. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. I just dropped the link to that form in the chat if you are willing to take it. Thank you very much and
Thank
have
you
a good
all.
one.